All right, hello, welcome everyone to the ICAST 2020 Online Conservation Seminar Series. The topic of this session is the Modern Fish Act, what progress has been made a year and a half after enactment. We've got a big, robust panel of a lot of experts who were involved in this historic legislation to help walk through the history of the Modern Fish Act, and then now that we've had a little bit of time to see it play out, where things stand in terms of improving federal marine fisheries management. So joining us on this session is Jeff Andrews, who's the president of the Center for Sport Fishing Policy, Chris Horton, who is the Senior Director of Fisheries Policy at the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation. I think Chris has a few more titles than that, but for today, at least, he'll be the Fisheries Policy Director. Chris Macaluso, who is the Center for Marine Fisheries Director at the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Neil McMillan, who's a legislative assistant with Senator Roger Wicker, and as we'll talk more about this, Senator Wicker was the lead author in the Senate of the Modern Fish Act, and so Neil therefore has a lot of history with this as well. And then Kelly Ralston, who's the Southeast Fisheries Policy Director for American Sport Fishing Association, and I'm Mike Leonard, Vice President of Government Affairs for ASA, and I will moderate our session today. So just to kick us off here, talking a little bit more about the Modern Fish Act. The long name of which is the Modernizing Recreational Fisheries Management Act of 2018. This is a bill that was really a long time coming for those of us that work on federal marine fisheries management, all of which is currently regulated under the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, which has been the law governing offshore federal fisheries since 1976. It has implications for state-managed fisheries, those that are inside 3 miles in most parts of the country or inside 9 miles in the Gulf, but primarily deals with those offshore fisheries. Again, having originated back in 1976, back when most of what was taking place offshore was commercial fishing, that's really historically what the Magnuson-Stevens Act has focused on. But over time, with the growth in recreational fishing, more interest in going offshore, boats getting bigger, safer, GPS, fish finders, et cetera, more interest in the American public going offshore and recreating and catching fish, the law that governs that activity never really was updated. So you still had this sort of square peg, round hole situation where a law that was set up to regulate commercial fishing was being used, which again is an activity that you're catching fish by the tons, was being used to regulate people that are just catching fish one at a time. And it led to a lot of inconsistency and a lot of frustration and just an incompatibility in how we were trying to manage these fisheries. The ideas behind the Modern Fish Act and the different provisions in them were, again, ideas that those of us in the recreational fishing community had been bouncing around for quite some time, ultimately bundled them together and worked them into a single standalone legislation called the Modern Fish Act, again, authored by Senator Wicker, which got across the finish line, was enacted, and was the first time there was ever a law enacted that focused entirely on saltwater recreational fishing and improving this activity for all of us. So really historic legislation, really aimed at providing more tools in the management toolbox, getting better data to address these long-standing challenges that we've been dealing with in the recreational fishing community. Again, now we've had some time to see it play out, and we'll talk some more about that. Before diving in, I'd like to invite Neil to provide his thoughts. Neil, appreciate you being with us today. I remember early on in your time with Senator Wicker, you were pretty new to the office, meeting with you on this bill. You're now, of course, a savvy Hill veteran. But if you could talk a little bit about those early discussions within Senator Wicker's office, what was sort of the interest, engagement, the recognition in these challenges around saltwater recreational fisheries, and what sort of played into the thinking of Senator Wicker wanting to take on this challenge that was no small task.
Thanks, Mike. Like I said, I'll start with the beginning of when the Modern Fish Coalition approached Senator Wicker's office with what became the Modern Fish Act and trying to bring recreational fishing to have a fair seat at the table in management, particularly with the focus on the Gulf of Mexico and Southeast region where recreational fishing is often at the forefront. And with my partner in the office, we were talking about fishing, and we know that fishing can be very controversial, and that the rec fishing community had in the past sometimes been aggressive and had aggressive pushback as commercial, charter, and rec kind of play tug of war over a finite resource. And so when discussing with Senator Wicker, we wanted to do something that was practical, that addressed the needs of recreational fishermen without stepping on the toes of commercial or charter guys, and would use the regional process to make sure that people in their region can make pragmatic management decisions that allow residents to access our natural bounty. So we want to be pragmatic and keep it in a regional focus. So the Modern Fish Act was a great effort for us because it used some of those existing systems like the councils, like our data collection processes. It leaned on the way states did management and hoped that we could provide a more fair seat at the table for recreational fishing. And once we realized that we could go in that direction and there was broad community support for that, we were all in. Senator Wicker fully supports that the conservation of our fishery resources supports access to our EEZ and the saltwater fishing we have there. And that access has a huge economy right behind it, whether that be boat building, tackle manufacturing, all that y'all are seeing at ICAST virtually this time really shows what's behind the individual fish that a family goes after, a group of friends goes after. And the concept that we can conserve it and support such an industry seemed like a win-win to Senator Wicker. So when we pushed forward the Modern Fish Act, we introduced the bill July 10th, 2017, so about 2 years from the time you'll be viewing this webcast. And we did so on a bipartisan basis with 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And we continued to keep modern fish as bipartisan as possible, finishing the bill with 9 Republicans and 9 Democrats. And it wasn't just coastal states and folks who were concerned with the Gulf of Mexico fisheries, which was Senator Wicker's top focus, but we had people from Hawaii to the Midwest supporting common sense recreational fisheries management, because the manufacturing, the tourism, those jobs really trickle all across the country. And I'm sure Senator Wicker hopes that the foundation we put through the Modern Fish Act can continue to help our nation recover, as we've been happy to see that there's been a renewed focus on fishing during this strange time. We had to get Modern Fish done through unanimous consent, which means all 100 senators had to agree. And that was quite an effort, particularly when we're trying to address allocation, management, catch shares, and data. But we continue to be transparent about that. We continue to show that we were not trying to subvert the council process, but to provide the council with the tools, the data, the legal backing to do what they needed to mimic some of the state management systems for recreational fishing, with the goal of getting more access while still doing conservation. We were able to pass it through the Commerce Committee with only 5 recorded no votes and 23 senators supporting. And that led to passing it a week before Christmas and President Trump signing it on New Year's Eve. So we really took it to the last minute, but it's a real credit to the recreational community and all the supporters who were behind it that we were able to go from meeting a problem that has been going on for decades to finishing a bill enacted into law during these partisan times within one single Congress. So it really is a tremendous tribute to the rest of the recreational supporting guys. And I thank all of y'all for providing a lot of feedback, on the ground management, and we're committed to making sure this is implemented faithfully and to continuing to solve recreational problems as well as other problems when they arise in federal fisheries.
All right, thanks, Neil, for that summary. It's a great job of condensing, 2 years worth, really longer than that, of effort, meetings, a lot of which you're trying not to pull your hair out. A lot of challenges and hurdles we had to get through to get this across the finish line, but I think your more condensed summary is a better way of putting it than going through all that long, frustrating history. So appreciate that, and appreciate all the effort you personally and obviously Senator Wicker put into no small feat. We've done that, and getting a bill enacted into law isn't by any means the finish line. It's a matter of making sure it's actually implemented properly, fishery by fishery, region by region. So to help us keep track of where things are, and in a lot of ways keep those responsible for enacting the law accountable, Jeff Andrews, I'll turn to you. We've got a progress report that the Center for Sport Fishing Policy has been spearheading to do just that, to hold NOAA Fisheries and the Regional Fishery Management Council accountable for making sure the law is implemented properly. So Jeff, do you want to tee up the progress report, and then we'll start ticking through it?
Sure enough, Mike. Thank you so much, and thank you for arranging this whole conservation series. I want to jump off of what Neil said before I talk about the progress report, because Senator Roger Wicker was not just the lead author of the bill. He was not just the chairman of the Commerce Committee. He really is the singular most important member of Congress to start this effort, to lead the effort, and to see it through to completion on Capitol Hill. It simply would not have happened without the leadership of Roger Wicker. And I think that recreational anglers all over the country owe him a debt of gratitude, because as we all know, for generations, federal fisheries management has been focused on the commercial sector, and the recreational fishing sector has always been an afterthought. The reality is we have over 10 million Americans who fish recreationally and who support 475,000 jobs and contribute $68 billion to the economy. We really shouldn't be an afterthought. This really shouldn't have taken federal legislation to focus the agency on the recreational fishing sector, but it did. So a special thank you to Roger Wicker. A special thank you also to my Congressman Garrett Graves from my hometown of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Garrett grew up here in South Louisiana fishing with his family. He understands that recreating with our families in salt water, it's what we do in the outdoors, and so it is as much a part of him as the mountains are for a congressman from Colorado. So Garrett stepping up to lead this battle in the House made all the difference. Having a legislator in each chamber from the Southeast was really apropos, because so much of the growth in marine fisheries has been in the Southeast over the last couple of decades. As Mike alluded to earlier, so many of us are able to get out to the fishing grounds so much easier, so much more safely, bring our families and recreate in America's great outdoors. We know that the agency had a predisposition to focus on the commercial fishing sector. It's simply the heredity of an agency that used to be called the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries. But with the passage of this law, with some other leadership changes at NOAA Fisheries, we've seen some progress. And as we try to track the progress of the provisions of the Modern Fish Act, we wanted to take a surgical look at exactly what the law says and what the federal government has done to implement those particular sections. The progress report that we published first at the end of last year and most recently just last week as an update is designed to grade the federal government on their timeliness in meeting specific deadlines, their inclusion of stakeholder input, and on the substance of the finished product. These grades are shown here as green, yellow, red, and the panelists that are going to follow are going to review the details of each. With 1 green, 3 yellows, and 1 red in this update to the progress report, we see that there's still a lot of work left to do to fulfill the expectations of the Modern Fish Act. But this discussion of a progress report, this hope to get the government to all greens, and the government actually wanting to get to all greens, has really opened up a great dialogue with NOAA Fisheries leadership. We, of course, are going to continue to work with Congress to provide oversight on these important issues, but our conversation today is really meant to focus on what has been the progress. So, Mike, I'll kick it back to you so we can go through the details.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Well, let's dive in. This was a bill that ultimately had 5 sections in it. I think it started with a few more than that, but going through the legislative process, the final outcome was 5 sections. So we're going to tick through them one by one, and I'll invite Chris Macaluso to talk about the first section of the bill, and that is the section that deals with the dirty 10-letter word in fisheries management, which is allocation. So, Chris, turn it to you. First, what is allocation? What did this section do, and where do we stand?
Well, Mike, as you mentioned, allocations are the thorniest subject at times when it comes to, what's dealt with at the regional councils. And allocations are basically, the government's decision about what sector gets to catch how much of a given fish. In the case of Gulf of Mexico red snapper, for instance, it's split roughly 50-50 commercial recreation. I believe right now you're at like 51% recreational, 49% commercial. It's changed a couple of times, but these are some of the most heated arguments that the councils have to deal with because a lot of those allocations have been locked in for a long time. The commercial fishery insists that it has to have these allocations locked in for lengthy periods of time in order for it to be able to borrow money and to make a living at their fishery. But I think it's very clear by the data that's been collected by the states and by NOAA Fisheries that it's time to take a look at these allocations because a lot of them need to be examined. Some of these allocations are based on data that's 30, 40 years old or more at this point. And it's very hard to get these councils to make decisions when it comes to taking a hard look at reallocating the resource for the best cultural and financial and economic needs of fisheries communities and as the nation as a whole. So what the Modern Fish Act asked of the GAO was that the Government Accountability Office conduct a study on the progress of reallocation or looking at allocations, examining allocations in the South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. In 2019, GAO researchers examined activity at the councils. They interviewed a lot of anglers and a lot of council members to see how progress was being made on allocations and to understand the challenges. The GAO then made 2 recommendations in its final report that NOAA Fisheries should work with the South Atlantic and the Gulf Council to develop a documented process for conducting allocation reviews and to specify how they will document their allocation reviews, including the basis for their decisions, whether the fishery management plan objectives are being met, what factors were considered in the reviews, and these recommendations signify there's still work to do on the allocation processes. They've taken a hard look at these allocation processes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these fish have been reallocated. So while we're putting together the mechanisms by which we can review allocations, we haven't seen a whole lot of reallocations take place, and that's going to be the next step. But the important part is getting the data, getting the science right, getting the economics right on these examinations, because I think anyone who fishes in the Gulf and the South Atlantic understands that, for a fish, say like red snapper, it's very clear evidence that it needs to be reallocated towards the recreational side. But there are other fisheries out there that could be reallocated to commercial fishing because the recreational side is just simply not going to meet its quota. And so we've understood this all along. This recommendation goes all the way back to the vision for managing America's saltwater recreational fisheries, which we like to call the Morris Deal Report, which was the first real hard examination of what recreational fishermen and what anglers need in terms of federal fisheries management. And that's something that a number of groups worked on that was released back in spring of 2014. So we've got a ways to go, but we've made some significant progress thanks to the GAO study coming out last year.
All right, thanks, Chris. We'll circle back to some questions, but let's run through the rest of it. So let's now turn to Chris Horton for section 102. This is the section that dealt with alternative management measures, and there was a lot of debate about the term alternative management. I think for those of us that were promoting this idea, it wasn't really alternative management, it was just good management that we were talking about. So Chris, could you run through this section? What new authorities or what new clarification was given, and what action have we seen to actually move NOAA fisheries towards these more tailored management approaches for recreational fishing?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. Actually, Section 102, I think, fundamentally is one of the most important things to come out of Modern Fish Act. And although it didn't authorize any new authorities, it clarified the authorities that already existed within the Magnuson-Stevens Act. And that is that we don't have to manage recreational fisheries solely on a hard pound quota, which is predominantly how NOAA Fisheries manages marine fisheries resources. If you think about it, this agency's been around for over 100 years. And back in the day, there wasn't a lot of recreational fishing. It was primarily commercial fishing. So hard pound quotas or hard poundage is kind of always been the currency for marine fisheries management. However, that may work for the commercial sector because you can almost count every single fish that's landed. For the recreational sector, you can't really do that, and especially not in the Southeast region, the South Atlantic and Gulf Councils, because there's so many thousands of points of entry that there's no funnel there to be able to intercept recreational anglers as they come in. So we were using this and we still do, the Marine Recreational Information Program, which is the federal program survey, to try to estimate how many fish we were catching. Well, that survey is a really good survey if you're looking at long-term trends across multiple species, but to do something like in-season management for red snapper, it was wholly inefficient. And so the reason our seasons kept getting shorter and shorter is because the prediction was we were going to catch our hard pound quota too quickly. Fundamentally, the problem with this management model is that you're trying to predict what's available to catch next year based on what was caught in previous years, and there's no way to account for a strong year class coming in, the recruitment of variability. So you may have a strong year class coming in that the models didn't predict years ago, and all of a sudden we catch a lot of fish. But relative to the overall population, we didn't really catch that. We didn't catch any more than we would have under the quota relative to the percentage of the population, but we overfished it, so we get punished for that. We get punished for what was actually a good thing, is that we had good recruitment. So the efficiency of managing the recreational community, the private recreational angler, on this hard pound quota system just doesn't work when you can't really get an accurate count of the hard pound quotas that we're catching. But Magnuson actually says that the catch rates can be defined by numbers of fish, pounds, sex, weight, area. I mean, there's a whole gamut of actually could be measured using different components of the recreational community that could get a little bit more accurate. So it was important that this section clarify that. However, changing NOAA's philosophy on management is, I liken it to trying to change course of a battleship with a boat paddle. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some pushing. Fortunately, the Modern Fish Act clarified that, yes, you can manage based on these other parameters or these other management approaches. So the door was cracked open. Unfortunately, we haven't seen just a whole lot of progress from NOAA. There was a council coordinating committee meeting last fall. I was invited to present some of these other alternative management approaches at that meeting, and I appreciate Noah for the opportunity to do that. From that meeting, fortunately, the South Atlantic and the Gulf Council staff and leadership have decided, yes, let's see if we can find a way. Let's see if we can find a pilot fishery to try out some of these experimental, or not experimental, but these proven fisheries management methods other than just hard pound quotas. So the doors cracked open. The South Atlantic and the Gulf Council are pushing, leaning into that door to see what they can come up with. And I think in order for Section 102 to really go to green, we really need to see NOAA working with those councils and whatever they come out with, and not just saying no, but saying, well, we can do this, and here's how we can do this.
All right, thanks, Chris. Well, sticking with you, let's move on to Section 103. We talked about how contentious allocations are. Limited access privilege programs, also known as cat shares, can be plenty contentious too. So another part of the bill that called for a study and examination into something that the recreational fishing communities experienced some challenges with. So Chris, walk us through sort of a brief history of our engagement with cat shares and what we hope might come from this study.
You bet. Thanks, Mike. Well, cat shares have been around for a while. They're part of a limited access privilege program. And cat shares basically allocate specific poundages of quota or the rights to harvest fish to individuals or vessels or even some community cooperatives. But the problems we see, and again, it stems back to really our experience with red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's the IFQs are given to individuals. They're given a certain percentage of the overall commercial quota that only they can harvest, or in the case of red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico, they can lease that. They don't even have to fish that quota. So they lease out the shares. And actually there are several shareholders that don't even own a vessel anymore, that don't even live on the coast, that basically are afforded this public trust resource, what seems like in perpetuity, even though it's not supposed to be a right, it's being treated that way essentially in the courts. So anytime you have a program, it's just good practice to go back and evaluate that program. And there's never really been, to anyone's knowledge, kind of an unbiased or objective evaluation of how well these programs work, where there might be some problems and challenges. I certainly don't think that the intent of catch shares was to be able to, take the power of the harvest of that quota away from local communities long term. So it was time to take a hard look at that. That panel is currently in progress. Ms. Ralston and I recently had a chance, as a matter of fact, 2 weeks ago to present to the National Academy of Sciences panel that's reviewing this. We had some great questions, and I think from the IFQ side or the catch share side, those perspectives were well represented as well. However, I do know that there are some additional commercial as well as some charter for hire folks that are wanting to provide some additional feedback from what they've heard. So the verdict's still out on what this objective analysis will look like in the end, but hopefully they're hearing enough from the right people to be able to make kind of an informed report on how these IFQs or these catch shares are working and how they could potentially be better moving forward.
All right, thanks, Chris. Well, a year and a half in, and we're still the initial meeting setting, but it's a slow process that the government works at sometimes. All right, well, thanks, Chris, for that perspective on those two important sections. So now turning to Kelly on a couple sections that dealt more with the data that feeds into management. First section, section 201, dealt a lot with state management and this longstanding challenge of getting NOAA Fisheries, the federal government, to be more accepting and inclusive of sort of third-party or non-federal government data. This is the only section of the bill that, according to our progress report, is still on red. So Kelly, talk us through where things stand with this section and why we're still sort of stuck on red here.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think both of the sections that I'm going to present on 201 and 202 really are focused on how to improve the use of recreational data in management, and kind of how NOAA can better integrate not only with the states but the councils to really improve management of the recreational sector. I think recreational data in general has been a challenge just because of how different recreational fisheries operate when compared to commercial. And I think Chris mentioned the MREP program, the Marine Recreational Information Program, and how that that system works really well in some circumstances, but not in others. And so I think what we're looking for in these next two sections are opportunities to be able to improve the information that's going into these management decisions. So not really sure how I got tasked with the one red dot in the whole report, but I will be happy to take a stab at kind of explaining that. Section 201 of the Modern Fish Act really was looking at ways for NOAA fisheries to better integrate state data into management decisions. And so the main outcome of that section was to look at providing an agency report on how they could better do that, how they could better facilitate that. And we saw a draft of that report come out last fall of 2019, and sent out to the councils for their input and conversation. And we saw that there were some issues with the overall substance of the report. You know, the report did a really good job of kind of explaining the status quo and what NOAA was currently doing, but where were the opportunities to improve that? And so that report is still in draft, and therefore the dot remains red. But we have been in conversations with NOAA Fisheries and understand that that report is close to being finalized and released. I think as part of kind of that whole section, of looking at some opportunities to help NOAA Fisheries look at additional opportunities, we've had some really good conversations with them. One has to do with a specific policy directive on kind of how the agency would incorporate state data into management decisions, and the potential for revising or at least revisiting that policy directive that would give greater latitude to including that data. Secondly, specific to the Southeast, looking at state management, particularly of red snapper, each of the Gulf states came up with their own data collection systems to better inform management so that they could get closer to not necessarily real time, but at least in-season management and managing to a quota. And that was really important in the federal decision for delegating that management authority to the Gulf states. And there's been some discrepancies back and forth with how that data is being used by the states versus NOAA. And we were really encouraged to hear, actually just today, that they've finalized a workshop between the states and the agency to really kind of work through those issues. Sticking with the Southeast, one of the other issues regarding data collection is in the South Atlantic. And we've really seen that lack of data, lack of in-season management information, and or stuff that are data that's specific to the actual fishery, because we have a lot of rare event. We have short seasons or no seasons or rare event species in the South Atlantic. Kind of what are some opportunities to improve the data there? And so we've been in conversations about perhaps having some sort of cooperative workshop, not only with the South Atlantic states, but with the agency to move that forward as well. So we're hopeful that that this will not stay on red. We are encouraged that the report is close to being issued, and look forward to reading the substance on that one.
All right, thanks, Kelly. Well, sticking with data and in addition to state data, another type of data collection that there seem to be a lot of historic challenges with and resistance to, which is electronic data, and the need for the federal data collection system to look at things like electronic smartphone data and alternatives to better meet the current management system we're under. So that's a lot of what section 202 dealt with, and the subsequent report that is being worked on or being set up. So Kelly, where are we with 202, please?
Yeah, so the Department of Commerce has contracted with the National Academy of Sciences to convene a panel to actually look on how they can improve in-season management of that recreational data collection program that the agency has, MRIP. We have been encouraged that they have had their first public meeting back in March of 2020. I think some of the timeliness and follow-up meetings, while I know they've had non-public meetings just for the panel, I think there is a real desire to engage the public and the recreational community, but they've been a bit stymied as to how to proceed given COVID-19 impacts, and they really wanted to have in-person workshops, but I think they're going to have to focus on some webinars for the near future. We've been encouraged that kind of the focus of that group is really to look at how they can improve the timeliness of the agency's recreational data. And so how can we get the good data sooner to be able to make better decisions in management? And then kind of part of that, and what I touched on in section 201, is where are those instances where MRIP maybe isn't the optimal data collection protocol, and where are those gaps? And then what kind of opportunities are there, whether it's state or academic resources to be able to supplement that MRIP data collection? And so I think we've seen with the first public meeting, a real inclination that those will be kind of the outcomes that this panel is looking at. And then following that up, we have been working really closely with NOAA leadership on developing an electronic reporting task force. So this is through the Marine Fisheries Advisory Committee, which I sit on, and that actually advises Secretary of Commerce on opportunities, affecting fisheries. And so this one in particular, this task force was strongly supported by NOAA Fisheries leadership to really look at how the agency can use and or support recreational electronic reporting data, whether that's voluntary or mandatory, kind of what would that look like, and how can the agency support that moving forward? We had our first monthly meeting on May 1st, and they've been scheduled through the end of the year. And the idea is that this task force complements that National Academy study that was requested in the Modern Fish Act. And so we look forward to kind of seeing how this process plays out, and therefore we kind of have the yellow tag on this one, because we have seen some really good progress and we have seen some strong support from the agency on this, and we're awaiting the outcome.
All right, thanks, Kelly. Well, let's bring everybody back on. If you all can get your webcams back up. Let's start transitioning from the details of the bill and kind of talk more big picture. Where do we go from here? So, Neil, I guess I'll start with you if you're still with us. There you are. Neil, we've talked through a lot of the substance of what went into this bill and what's happened, but your position there on the Hill, looking at Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization in general, obviously the Modern Fish Act was the first time since 2006 that a major set of changes were made to the Magnuson-Stevens Act. We still have some work to be done, clearly, some of which I think to really fully get to where we need to go as a community might require additional legislation. So, what do you see as far as any changes to Magnuson-Stevens Act in the near future, either individually or as a bundle? Where do you see the current Congress or potentially future Congresses going with next steps on Magnuson?
Thanks, Mike. Well, one of the things I like to quip about Magnuson-Stevens is the Modern Fish Act made it very popular. People used to complain about Magnuson-Stevens, and then when we started doing a common sense bill with bipartisan support to help one sector get a fair seat, all of a sudden Magnuson became a very cherished bill. So I think we were accomplishing both things there. For the rest of this Congress, I don't anticipate any large-scale effort to reauthorize Magnuson-Stevens unless something changes. I don't hear rumblings about that. To do a Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization requires months and months and months of work, and to my knowledge, there hasn't been a really strong stakeholder need to justify that effort, whether that's in the commercial charter or rec sector, given that we're still having the modern fish implemented. A couple of places I do see fisheries action going on would be the fishery disaster process. There's interest, including Senator Wicker's bill, the fishery fund, to get disaster funding to fishermen and fishing communities quicker. And they need a lot of relief after COVID as well, with all the restaurants closed, and that's a big seafood blow. But those type of relief and recovery efforts, I think, will be the focus of Congress for the rest of the year.
All right, thanks, Neil. I guess diving back into the report, some follow-up. Chris Macaluso, turning to you back to allocation. You know, I mentioned earlier that there were maybe a few provisions of the Modern Fish Act that got taken out during the process. Even with the provisions that got enacted, there were some changes made, including with the allocation section. The original language called for actual, real, legitimate examinations of allocations and adjustments to actually force the councils to go in and look at existing allocations. We ended up with the report. So, Chris, what in this report, what do you see, if any, motivation, justification for potentially going back to that original idea of, you know, unless there's some sort of forcing mechanism, it's not clear that the motivation exists for the councils to actually take up allocations on their own?
Well, Mike, I think that's a good question, I don't really, I don't have a firm answer of what it's going to take. I think what it's going to take really is for us to, you know, as recreational fishermen, to engage with the councils, to engage with our council members, and force this to be a priority for those who represent the recreational and the commercial side on the councils. I mean, I think it's very clear, you know, in the case of, say, Gulf of Mexico red snapper or Gulf of Mexico king mackerel, for instance. I think the data is very clear that a reallocation is required, is necessary. You know, it's required just to meet the standards set by the Magnuson-Stevens Act that we're using the best available science and data to us. I think that alone should be the force to these councils to make these decisions. Being a council member, you know, we appreciate those who serve on councils because it takes a lot of time and commitment. I think more so than a lot of us realize sometimes when you look at the amount of information that they've got to examine. But being a council member can be a very difficult thing, and they need to make difficult decisions sometimes when it comes to how these fish are allocated. That's what the law says that they have to do, and so I don't think it's I don't think we can allow the council members and can allow the agency to just not make hard decisions. I think they need to make the decisions based on the data that's available to them.
Hey, Mike, can I jump in?
Yep, please.
So there are a couple things I think that will bring this to a head, at least from what I've seen in the Southeast so far. One of those has to do with the revisions that have happened to that marine recreational program. And it's really shifted kind of some of the historic thinking on how much anglers have harvested over the years, kind of time immemorial back in that program. And so that change is prompting at least the Gulf and South Atlantic councils, I think, to have to take a hard look at individual species allocations. And then kind of from a broader perspective, to Chris's point, I do think it's incumbent upon the angling community to make sure that the councils understand how important this process is. And I know in conversations at the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, for example, I think the council is moving towards trying to develop a general criteria for how they will approach allocations as opposed to, you know, a species by species. So I just wanted to add that in.
All right, thanks, Kelly. Chris Horton, back to the alternative management section, which I think you noted was one of the more important parts of this bill. It's been interesting and kind of frustrating to talk about this concept over the years, where we would go to federal fisheries managers and talk about these other concepts, and they'd say, oh, well, you got to change Magnuson. Okay, well, we got some changes to Magnuson, and well, actually, maybe it's the national standard guidelines that's really holding us up. And then other times the conversation was actually, well, we do have this authority. We've chosen not to use it. So from your perspective, what's really the holdup? What really is it going to take to get these type of changes implemented?
That's a great point, Mike, and that is it. I mean, we just keep getting kind of the runaround. We don't have the authority, or well, it's in there, but we choose not to use it, or it's in S1. Well, National Standard 1 is an administrative policy to implement the provisions of Magnuson-Stevens Act. It can be updated through the public review process, but it can be updated. So I think what's going to have to happen is exactly, very hopeful what's happening, because it's going to be the councils that drive this and not NOAA Fisheries, obviously. Again, the battleship hasn't even begun to turn yet. We're not paddling hard enough there, but the councils, if they can come up with a pretty good pilot program, picking a fishery that maybe MRIP has struggled to be able to collect the right data, and coming up with a different way to manage that fishery, presenting it statistically valid and science-based as it will be, as the states manage other fisheries, not based on hard pound quota, but other management threshold indices that we can get good data around, and not a hard pound quota. I think that's where the rubber's going to meet the road. And if it still comes back to National Standard 1, we just can't do that. Well, what do we need to fix in National Standard 1? Because we've already clarified through the Modern Fish Act that Magnuson does give us that authority. So if it's National Standard 1 that's holding us up, let's fix that. And I think we can do that easier than fixing the Magnuson-Stevens Act, because we don't need to.
Yep, thanks, Chris. Kelly, Gulf red snapper has been mentioned a couple times here, and circling back to data collection, folks may starting to hear some rumbling challenges in the Gulf with a lot of the state surveys that were really the motivation behind some of what we saw in the Modern Fish Act in terms of these superior alternative ways of collecting data to what federal government's been going. But now, now that there seems to be a disconnect between those numbers, between state numbers and the federal numbers, things seem to be coming to a head. So what's that exactly going on with Gulf red snapper, and what are some of the things that we risk if these state surveys were to be undermined or be legitimatized?
Thanks, Mike. I think there are a couple of things that have really kind of led to some of the challenges, the recent challenges that we're hearing about in the Gulf. One has to do with kind of the individual state data collection processes, and that they're all different. And so that's fine from an individual state data, but I think it creates some challenges when you're trying to incorporate something at the national level. And NOAA Fisheries did actually certify all of those programs, meaning that they are identified as statistically valid and good data. I think the challenge has come related to the policy directive that we talked about earlier, and that NOAA Fisheries is now having to go through the process of taking that state data and trying to calibrate it back or reconcile it with MRIP. And so we're seeing some discrepancies, mainly because of the differences in the state data collection processes. And so there's been a real challenge, I think, because some of the states are much more different than MRIP. And so between the agency and the individual states and the Gulf Council, they're trying to go back and reconcile this. And there is a workshop scheduled for this month for that process to hopefully happen and be finalized. I think at stake is state management. And so this is a really big deal because if we are not able to kind of reconcile the numbers or come up with a path forward, that those differences could really derail the whole process.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Well, for a system that we thought was kind of running smoothly and thought we'd been through so many of the challenges, it's a shame to be at this point, especially where the federal system, which has been so widely criticized, is being held as the benchmark that these much more robust state surveys have to be held against. So hopefully we can get through that.
Well,
Jeff,
Mike, I'd like to chime in if that's
Yeah,
okay. Some of these state systems, the confidence in the numbers that are being produced are much, much higher than what we're seeing out of the MRIP system. And for us to be, talking about taking a step back here because we can't get this data to be calibrated the right way, it's just a terrible message to be sending to the angling community. The recreational fishermen have been through these battles in the Gulf. There is just no way that we're going to go back to 9 or 11 or 3-day seasons because the federal data collection system isn't working. These state data collection systems are superior. I think they're capturing a lot more of the effort. And I think all of that's being borne out. And as Kelly mentioned, it's been certified by the federal government. We just cannot afford to take steps back when it comes to the way these fish are managed in the Gulf of Mexico. We should be using this as a model to go into other parts of the country and saying, this is a way that we could try to fix some of these other data collection problems that we're facing. Instead of talking about having to scale these things back because we're using it, because of this desire to use an inferior system.
Well, and I think to your point, Chris, I think it is the conundrum, right? The whole reason that the states implemented their own data collection programs was because of the challenges with MRIP, particularly in these offshore fisheries that MRIP doesn't necessarily do a great job of sampling. So it is, it's incredibly frustrating.
Well, Neil, from your position there on the Hill where everybody came in to fuss at you about different parts of the Modern Fish Act, was this really a controversial issue, the idea of states developing supplementary or alternative data collection systems?
It's funny you say that, Mike. Section 201, as well as 202, so the electronic reporting and especially the state data collection efforts were intact almost the entire way. We had very little negative feedback, almost to a T. Hill staffers and their senators and their reps thought this was made a lot of sense, using smartphones, using well-established, certified, more accurate state data. That was seen as really one of the successful ways to justify some management measures, and it's really surprising to me to see that as a red, and not just ranked as a red, but as an issue that seems to be deteriorating right now based off the success of the past few years. So it's quite surprising, and programs like Mississippi's Tails and Scales, which in my view is one of the most accurate ones because we have such a small contained fishery, to see it not trusted is really troubling.
And Mike, can I add I want to add on that topic. It was only earlier this year that that state management was finalized for Gulf red snapper. And I know we always talk in the macro about the whole Gulf. We talk about particular states, and Louisiana's La Creole is another one of the leaders in data collection here. But the macro is important. The micro, I think, is also important because in the spring of 2017 at my house, me and my 3 kids were told that we had 3 days to go and fish for Gulf red snapper. 3 days. That's it. We had to plan our entire summer around 3 days that may or may not be fishable, and it was really the beginning of the end. Last year, conversely, we had, because of a superior data system, La Creole, 109 days when we could make plans to go and catch Gulf red snapper, the filet mignon of the Gulf. And I think it's a function. It's a direct function of the accuracy of the data, how well it's collected, the respect that the data system has gotten all over the Gulf, and that it's been emulated, and the partnerships that it developed with all 5 states coming together to tell the federal government on Gulf red snapper, you're not doing it right. We'll take care of it. That's a big victory for the states and the recreational fishing community. And frankly, it was a huge acknowledgement in the status quo of federal management that they weren't doing the job well. Now, all of a sudden, there's a sense that we need to recalibrate to numbers that were the problem in the first place. I've still got those 3 kids. We sure enjoyed our opportunity to get on the water for us last summer when it was timely and the weather was good and we can make plans to do it. And all of the reasons why having a longer season is better, not the least of which is effort flattens out when you have a longer, more predictable season. That's the way it is in fisheries management. We really don't need to be rolling back the clock to accommodate a threatened lawsuit from one of the ENGOs.
Yeah, so, well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks, everybody. The Modern Fish Act wasn't just about Gulf red snapper, but it is the poster fish for a lot of the ideas that went into it. So it makes sense we would have to spend time talking about what's going on currently in that important fishery. So, Jeff, sticking with you, we've talked a lot in this report about sort of the NOAA fisheries itself response. Of course, there's also direction that comes from higher ups within the Department of Commerce. I guess, how would you gauge under this administration, under Secretary Ross, that level of engagement on these types of issues, on the recreational fishing community's issues, and where do you see that kind of blending into this progress report?
Well, Wilbur Ross has been a great advocate for Americans having access to America's public resources. He understands what that means. And whereas most secretaries of commerce in prior administrations that I've dealt with have been focused on what they thought about the Commerce Department when they got there and what they thought about trade, etc. Wilbur Ross got to his desk downtown DC, and he understood that NOAA particularly was a huge part of what commerce does, and he embraced all of it. He wanted to do everything that he could do to be encouraging, every sector of the economy to hum. We really met with him very early in this process, and we spoke about what is the economic impact of marine recreational fishing. And we were never trying to take anything away from the commercial sector, but he was very welcoming from the first meeting, the week after he was confirmed, to have a conversation and to recognize what we do to contribute to the economy. He understood that 2.2% of America's GDP comes from outdoor recreation, and that the fastest growing segment of that was fishing and boating. So everything that he's done, in my view, has been to foster that. And what a blessing to have someone who is worldly and understands all the different facets of an important agency like that. Now, we've also been very lucky to have at the helm at NOAA Fisheries, Chris Oliver. Chris is a native Texan. He grew up fishing on the Texas Gulf Coast. He's been in Alaska as the executive director. He was in Alaska for many years with the North Pacific Council, and since this administration started, he's been back at the head of NIMFS. But he understands both commercial and recreational. He understands getting people to the table to have a conversation, and he's been very welcoming of a dialogue, and I mean, I've been very much encouraged. All of the management of the agencies, always goes in the executive branch to the political appointees, and I've got to say I've been pretty pleased with what the Trump administration has done at the Department of Commerce.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So one final question, Jeff, I'll start with you, but welcome anyone's feedback on this one. We've talked about the sort of historic nature of the Modern Fish Act. This is the first time there was ever a law enacted that focused solely on saltwater recreational fishing. Neil talked about some of the opposition, different stakeholder groups expressing concern to various parts of the bill. If you look at marine fisheries, there's always the three stakeholder groups. There's recreational fishing, there's commercial fishing, there's environmental interests that are very rarely, if ever, all three aligned. Sometimes you can get two of them on the same side, but this was an example where just us as a community were off on our own, fighting for some change that the other two sides that have historically had a whole lot more influence over this type of policy than we have, we're on the other side in a lot of ways. So I guess, what do you view, sort of taking the policy out of it, but politically, what did we achieve here in getting this done? The fact that this was the recreational fishing community on its own pushing, and despite all that opposition, we're actually able to get a bill enacted into law.
Well, Mike, Neil framed it very well. The Modern Fish Act was all about the recreational fishing sector having a seat at the table. It was never about, and it's never going to be about, taking anything away from any other sector. The recreational fishing community really represents America's first environmentalists. We're the guys who have been paying the freight for conservation for generations. We've been engaged in wanting to make sure that we've got a healthy resource since we've been around. And the folks in the commercial sector also want there to be a healthy resource. Likewise, for a lot of folks in the environmental community, there are a lot of commonalities that we can reach when we do sit down at the same table. And I think that in years past we have. For the Modern Fish Act, you're exactly right. We didn't want to wait for the other two legs of the stool to decide what they wanted in a Magnuson reauthorization. We knew what we were interested in. We knew that it wasn't anything but good management and a seat at the table. So we put our ideas in that standalone bill that you spoke about at the beginning, and Roger Wicker took it and dragged it across the finish line. I can see a lot of commonalities of interests with the commercial sector and the environmental sector in the coming years, because these tweaks that got us a seat at the table are a really good start. We've still got a good ways to go, and I think all sectors will be able to agree on that.
Great. Anyone else want to jump in on what we do to sort of seize on that higher profile, and what it may have signified, the fact that as a community we were able to get this standalone bill done?
Well, Mike, I'll just chime in briefly. I think it's important for us to recognize that when we unite, as we did with the Morse Deal report, as we did, to get the Modern Fish Act passed, that Congress does listen to us. I know there's this sentiment among the public a lot of times that, that senators and congressmen are deaf to what we're asking for. But I think when you go in with a united front from the conservation perspective, from the advocacy perspective, from the economic perspective, when you go in with a common ask, you can get some things accomplished. And I think as we move towards, potentially a Magnuson reauthorization sometime in the next couple of years, I mean, who knows? We've been saying that for 5 or 6 years now, that, they're bound to do something with Magnuson at some point. Who knows when that's going to happen? But there are some things, I think, that were identified in the Morse Deal report that we still need to work on. Forage fish being one of them primarily, that I think is important to us. And I think if we go forward as a community with that united front again, and asking for there to be that understanding of the need to better manage forage base, or really any of the things that we need, improvements to data collection, et cetera, that we can get those things included in a Magnuson the same way we got the Modern Fish Act passed.
Yeah, the only other thing that I would add is I think we've been trying to get some of these changes we wanted in Magnuson based on other Magnuson reauthorization, the bigger, the whole package type reauthorizations, and unfortunately we weren't able to be, well, number one, we didn't see those get across the finish line, but it was very difficult to get our changes that we needed to see in any bill that was advancing. And so I think it was a very wise decision for us to say, okay, let's just come up with what we want to see changed as an amendment, because I think people understand we're not trying, as Jeff mentioned, we're not trying to take anything away from the commercial side. We just want an actual legitimate seat at the table. Let's look at at how we can manage the recreational sector based on the contributions that we make to the economy, to the fishery, to conservation. You know, we just wanted a fair shake at the table. And I think whenever Magnuson is reauthorized, and it will be at some point in the future, I think the fact that we were able to get this amendment and bring logical arguments to the table, because again, we don't want to take anything away, and we absolutely don't want to catch every last fish out there. I mean, we're more about encounters than pounds of harvest. I mean, we just want opportunities. We want to have a chance to catch some fish. We definitely don't want to see a fishery overfished or undergoing overfishing by any means. It puts, I mean, that doesn't benefit the industry, doesn't benefit us as anglers. And I think we're able to make a lot of headway in recognizing that, yes, the things that we want are science-based for the good of the fishery, the good of the country, just like the commercial side. So I think whenever the next reauthorization does come along, I think we will have doors open to us more so this time around than we have in the past.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think that Modern Fish Act has opened a dialogue between the recreational community and the fishery management councils and NOAA Fisheries. And I think the outcomes of the Modern Fish Act, several of the reports and conversations, and that public council process, I think will position the recreational community for inclusion in the next Magnuson reauthorization. So I think it's two steps. There's an immediate ramification, and I think there's some long-term benefits to come out as well.
All right, well, I think that's a good note to end on. So thanks everyone for your time and insights, a lot of real great feedback, and maybe we'll welcome everybody back a year from now, hopefully in person for a Modern Fish Act 2.5 years after enactment. Who knows what we'll be talking about? Hopefully a little bit more yellow and green than red and yellow, and maybe Neil will be talking about a Modern Fish Act 2.0 at that point if it comes to that.
The very Modern Fish Act.
There you go. So anyway, thanks again, everyone, for your time and insights, and hope everyone takes care and stays safe out there. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mike.